We're going to talk about the container ecosystem, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I actually attended a venture capitalist conference yesterday, and those guys love to bring geeks in and grill them about how they can make money with new trends. And 5 years ago it was cloud, and then it was public cloud, and now it's containers. And the reality is my advice to them and the companies that they had in their portfolios were, it's really too late for you to be a container vendor, or even to provide scheduling services and clustering services and things like that. However, ecosystems around containers are actually pretty weak. We still need security, governance, management, compliance, all these sorts of things which are very important to us operationalizing this stuff. And I'm a consultant. I'm out there building container-based systems for ISVs. And the tough part is not building them. The tough part is putting them into operations and running them for an extended period of time. So hopefully the container ecosystem will get better as time goes on, because we're knitting a lot of the things ourselves, and I don't want to be in that business. So we're going to talk about that today, why it's important, how it's growing, and what you should be looking at. First, I'd like to introduce my panel from immediate right.
Cool. Hi, I'm Luke Marsden, CTO at ClusterHQ. We're connecting the container universe to the storage universe, and been working on stateful containers since 2008.
I'm Cord Campbell. I'm the evangelist for Giantswarm. We're a less opinionated container stack, and we're based out of Germany.
My name is Degioanni. I'm CEO of Sysdig. We provide monitoring and troubleshooting tools for containers and container ecosystem infrastructures.
I'm Gabriel Monroy, CTO at Deis. We produce Deis, the open source PaaS, and a bunch of other tooling on top of Kubernetes.
So I'm going to put out the first question there. It's a core question. What are the trends right now in the ecosystem in containers? Containers is so new, we don't even really consider the ecosystem. It's not on analyst radar screens. People aren't writing and speaking about it a lot, but it's an exploding market out there. So tell me what's going on. Gabriel, I'll start with you.
Oh gosh. I think there's a couple things I'd point out. There's sort of a battle right now in what I call the cluster manager space, which is this layer between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, where you sort of deal in groupings of I think the Google guys call it logical infrastructure, which I think makes a lot of sense. And you see, so Docker Swarm. Kubernetes, of course, and Mesos, all kind of playing in this intermediate layer. And it seems like the balance is starting to tip in the favor of Kubernetes in terms of the actual deployments that we're seeing out in the field. But I think there's still a lot of problems with regard to just general scalability of some of these solutions, but also specifically things like storage and networking. Networking is I think a pretty big problem specifically. I think you could generously call the state of network security in container deployments a trash fire right now. Everything can talk to everything else. It's kind of a nightmare. There's some folks working to solve this, but we got a ways to go.
When most of the networking implementations are actually user level, that makes me a bit nervous typically.
Yeah, although we're seeing moves away from that, fortunately now.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Luke, got an opinion?
Yeah, so it's been interesting watching the container ecosystem evolve over the last sort of 2 years since Docker really sort of started taking off. And I think what's interesting for me is really starting to see the uptick in the trend of people trying to put this stuff into production. I guess so the last year or so there was a lot of Docker and containers in CI, CD, and test and dev. And we're really seeing a lot of people actually try and put it in the fire of production now. And I think I used to say that there were 4 things that need to be solved to get containers in production working. I've now upped my estimate to 6. So let's see if I can remember 6 things. I guess, scheduling. So like figuring out where to put your containers, actually harder than it sounds. Composition, being able to describe a multi-container app as a set of connected containers. Networking, allowing your containers to talk to each other. Storage, allowing your containers to write some data to disk and then maybe get rescheduled somewhere else and have that data that they need and be able to read and write it. And then there's obviously security, And I've forgotten the sixth one. So anyone want to put a sixth in?
Monitoring.
Monitoring, that's the one.
What about governance?
Governance, okay. There's many things.
7.
There's at least 7 things.
Okay, I think there's probably about 24.
Okay.
Yeah, if we sit down and name them, I'm sure we can come up with them.
Yeah.
So what are you guys doing at Giantswarm right now to kind of make hay in the container market as it's rising up?
Yeah, I'm the only U.S. component of the company, so based out in the Bay Area. So I've been working on focusing on ISVs who have been asked by their customers to start deploying their SaaS solutions on-prem. So I'm focusing on that area because, you know, I run the SF Microservices meetup, and you know, I typically will poll the crowd whenever they come in, and we're seeing a lot of interest in container technologies, but then whenever you see people wanting to convert their stack, I mean, I've done operations and development. I've done both sides of the house, and I don't really want to retool my stack to run on containers and then be woken up in the middle of the night. So people need a strong incentive to be able to containerize their application, and so we're seeing these ISVs who are currently running SaaS services being asked by their customers to deploy that same solution on-prem. So I'm focusing on that. And also certainly the you know, operationally stable software is important, so we're seeing a lot of requests for that. At the same time, the developers are able to be flexible enough that they can use it without getting operations team involved.
So one of the things that seems to be hindering containers right now is not the technology, but it's the skill sets. So in other words, there's people who are, you know, not probably attending this conference and probably not aware of what containers can do and not able to take advantage of it. So even enterprises that want to get into it, they just don't have the people around to do that. How can we change that? And we had the same problem with cloud, and it still hasn't changed. So how can we, containers are, you know, development paradigm, architectural paradigm, service paradigms are much more complex. So how do we build good container developers, good container architects?
Well, I mean, doing developer evangelism, I've been doing that since my Splunk days. And, you know, the thing is that you've got to do stuff that's interesting to get people engaged. And then you know, it helps to do videos and example applications and, you know, speak to use cases that are real world. You know, the Minecraft stuff is awesome. I play Minecraft. I mean, who plays Minecraft? Yeah, I mean, I love Minecraft, and containerizing Minecraft is awesome, but a real world example is something that, like continuous CI/CD stuff. Like if I'm converting to containers, how do I move to a CI/CD pipeline and be able to get my application deployed continuously so that, you know, I can get back to coding and getting things up and running. So I think it's educating around those things, and all of us to be able to take what we're doing and capture our day-to-day activities that we're doing with containers and share it with other people. I mean, it's really about sharing our knowledge with other people. And that's a tricky bit.
It is a tricky bit. Gabriel, how are you guys getting the word out? How are you building experts in containers?
So, you know, the way we look at it is, you know, when you look at a cluster manager and sort of the idea of Google's infrastructure for everyone else, you know, it's really helpful to take a look at what Google's operational model is. And Joe Beta actually talked at length about this at KubeCon, and you know, what they do there is they have this segmentation of like OS ops, cluster ops, and then application ops. And I think viewed in that context, OS ops is like, you know, the bit twiddlers and the folks running and racking, stacking servers, and you know that can kind of be abstracted by kind of the IaaS layer. The cluster ops layer really feels like, you know, an area where there should be some more industry-wide emphasis on skill set specialization. But the truth is, there shouldn't have to be a huge team managing a 1,000-node, you know, Kubernetes cluster, for example. It can be a pretty small team. I think what ends up happening there is that the traditional DevOps skill sets move up to what's called AppOps, or what Google calls, you know, what are SREs inside of Google, where they get to really stay close to the developers and focus on sort of application level concerns, monitoring and telemetry, and you know, how to do, you know, canaries and rolling deploys and stuff like that. And there's a lot of value add there, but you really need to view that cluster manager layer as, you know, for most traditional ops backgrounds, like just assume that API is going to be there and it's going to be stable for you, and don't have to worry about it too much. Get some specialization there.
Loris?
Another thing about operation people in general is looks like things are always changing and changing faster and faster, right? I remember like 5 years ago, we were all trying to memorize all these cloud and AWS acronyms, right? EC2, RDS, ELB, and scrambling for that. And now it's like, oh my God, we're starting again, replication controllers and pods and all of this kind of stuff. It's like, if you look at a developer, like 15 years ago, a developer was doing something very similar. Yeah, there are new frameworks. Sometimes there's a new language that the community embraces now, like Go is really hot. But more or less, the job of a developer is very similar to what it was like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Looks like operation people have a revolution. Used to have a revolution every 5 years. Now it's like every 18 months, right? Containers are being adopted so fast. So from one point of view, it's like, yeah, we need to make an effort to get people up to speed with this and trained. On the other hand, it's like just seems to become more and more the nature of this industry. And the fact that it evolves so fast, and for the moment, there doesn't seem to be any real slowdown. Docker started existing essentially, less than 2 years ago, right?
Are we moving too fast?
Maybe it's good.
It's good we move fast, or good we...
So my comment is more like the fact that skills are hard to find is clearly a consequence of this. Maybe moving fast is good, but for sure one of the trade-offs is, you need to train people. They need to relearn things very often, and it's hard to find people that are skilled.
What do you think?
So I think one of the ways in which it might be possible to help operations people adopt containers is by building bridges between the systems that they're currently operating and the systems which the developers are demanding. And I know that we all talk in the industry about like the future of like containers replacing VMs and just rolling out completely commodity infrastructure and running container clusters on that. But that's really scary to an ops person in an enterprise because they've already got like a networking setup they like, they've got a storage setup they like, and so on. And so I think that there's definitely scope to integrate the tools in a way that that makes sense to the enterprise ops person. And just one example of how we're doing that at ClusterHQ is we're integrating with pretty much every different storage array on the planet. We've had VMware write a Flocker driver. We've got Dell, EMC, NetApp, HP, and many others have written Flocker storage drivers, and that means that you can run a containerized application like a Kubernetes or a Swarm or a Mesos, and take advantage of those underlying resources in a container-native way without having to throw it all away and completely start from scratch. So I think incrementalism on the infrastructure side is probably one way forwards.
And that's really where the ecosystem plays a role, right? Because Docker and CoreOS cannot cover all of these by themselves.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I heard it from a speaker this morning. They basically said we need to adopt cloud, and basically they got that out into the enterprise, and they got the developers over on the cloud system, and then they brought in containers on top of that, and they brought in new data systems. They brought in lots of different things that keep layering on top of it. So we're changing so fast, and he actually mentioned that they're saturated with change. They just can't seem to change anymore. Are we having those kinds of challenges inside of enterprises?
Well, microkernels.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the next thing that's going to hit.
Okay.
Presumably. Yeah, I mean, I felt compelled to go and understand how microkernels worked and compiled an application using it. And so, I mean, this evolution of this disruptive technology, I mean, we're all hooked on it, and it's accelerating, and it's disruptive, and it creates new business models and new opportunities. But then it seems like we're trying to fill the pipeline for workers as fast as we can. I mean, I'm in San Francisco, and it's very competitive to hire people there. So
yeah, but what about the tire shop in the Midwest that is looking to modernize their infrastructure? should they look at containers? Should they look at cloud?
I think one of the problems that is kind of blocking adoption today gets back to something Luke mentioned before, which is the idea of composite applications and the idea of end-to-end. All right, I stood up my Kubernetes or my Docker Swarm or my whatever. Now what? Right, and so that I think is a real problem facing folks. And actually, one of the reasons why I think Mesos has seen such relative success early on is because they have a bunch of frameworks that work and provide Spark and HDFS and a bunch of stuff that folks really need right now. And it works more. I mean, it can be a bear to set up, but you can get it running. You can get business value out of it at the end of the day. The tire shop, they could have a really audacious IT person who stands up a Kubernetes cluster and has a workload they want to put onto it, and it's sort of now what, right? We're trying to solve this with a project we've released recently from the Deis team called Helm, which is a package manager for Kubernetes designed to sort of address this composite application problem. How do you bundle up manifests that reference a series of source images and as a community, use kind of a homebrew style, decentralized, Git-backed model to share best practices for modeling workloads that can actually run it. And I think the better we do at solving that last mile of getting the application running on the thing, the faster we'll see this technology applied to the tire shop.
And I think that was the point I was trying to get to. So in other words, say it's a tire manufacturer in the Midwest, so they have a $10 million IT budget. $10 million IT budget, and they're trying to build it. But if there's an ecosystem of tools out there, it makes things easier. It basically removes the risk of them moving to containers. And really, that ecosystem is out there, but it's not to the point that I think it needs to be there. So the less innovative IT shops out there are able to adopt containers. They certainly know containers. They certainly say it. And they hire lots of people to basically tell them if they should move containers or not. But if you look at it, there's a lot of risk involved in them moving that way right now because the ecosystem isn't baked out yet.
Yeah, and I think de-risking this whole proposition is really the thing that the ecosystem needs to be focused on more broadly. And the way I look at it is there's all this innovation going on, and this rush and flood of innovation can be overwhelming at times, but it's a good thing, right? Because out of that is going to bubble out some really good projects, and then behind these efforts come things like the CNCF, which are going to actually take the best of what ends up getting developed out of all that frothy innovation, standardize on it, and then provide some level of risk tolerance, acceptability for enterprises.
So Luke alluded to it. Hang on, Laura. So I'll get back to you in a second. So Luke alluded to it as well. We're missing pieces, and I think he listed 6. I gave him one more. I think there's probably more like 24. Pieces that we're missing when you get into it. And when you start peeling back the onion, you find lots of different things that you need when you operationalize these things. So what are the things in priority order that we should look at in building the ecosystem? Loris, you go ahead.
That's a very good question. I can think about six things. Well, in a general way, by the way, as natural for our company, we're talking to a lot of people that are really at that stage of trying to move things to production, right? Maybe our containers seem to have started from developers, right? They start adopting them, using them, and then it's like they want to have this everywhere, and so they go to the operation team and ask to enable them to have it everywhere. So I don't know exactly what the exact priority order is, but for sure, one of the reasons why we're seeing this heated space at the orchestration layer is because that's really the first thing. The fact that the tire manufacturer is looking into using container is something very interesting and very exciting because typically these kind of companies jump into something new not just because it's a fad, but because it brings really real new value. And you can capture the new value that containers are bringing only if you have either you're playing with it or only if you have an orchestrator on top of it that lets you essentially automate everything that is related with running them. So for sure, everybody seriously adopting containers will have to pick their own container orchestrator. Right. For sure, what we saw with virtual machines and with cloud computing, respectively, like 15 years ago and 10 years ago, we are going to see it with containers. So storage, networking, visibility, for sure, these will all have to be addressed. You cannot go in production with containers without good visibility. You cannot go to production with containers without a clear story on what you're going to do, for the storage. So I think, this panel is a good example of priorities that need to be solved for containers. And the reason why we exist and our companies exist is exactly because there's somebody out there with a need, and we're working at solving the need.
So instead of the multi-millions that are going into the container providers, we should be going into the ecosystem providers right now to solve that problem. And the more you solve the ecosystem problem, the more adoption of containers will happen. So it's razor blades, right?
Yeah. I think absolutely. So if, it's really, as any ecosystem, ideally it's a win-win situation, right? So of course, we're all rooting for CoreOS and Docker to be successful because our business depends on that. But of course, we are building, all of us, some really solid technologies that can only make CoreOS and Docker and any other, container technology better.
Okay. What are you guys doing at Giantswarm? What's the strategy there around prioritization of some of the ecosystem-based technology?
Well, it's operational stability primarily. I mean, really about...
Which is a key problem.
It's a key problem. I mean, from an operational standpoint, I put them on my operations hat. I don't want my stack to fall over when my developers do something, naughty, right? I want my developers to be able to do whatever they'd like to do with the infrastructure, and be able to handle that without waking me up in the middle of the night. And I'd like them to be able to do that in a flexible way. I think that one of the challenges in trying to get the developers moving in the right direction, setting the right intent, is to be able to encourage them to get this CI/CD pipeline set up and testing. I mean, especially if you look at, we haven't talked about SOA yet, but like the whole microservices promise is that in large organizations, you're able to take the groups and separate them. So that's a big focus for us, is to allow the developers to be able to deploy their own service that other services inside the organization rely on, but then also give them the tools to be able to realize when another service has gone away or is having issues, and to be able to handle that in a graceful way without having to wake up the ops guys.
So this is basically a solution of abstraction. We're trying to take the developers away from the core infrastructure where damage can be done. We're putting policies and rules around the way in which they deal with continuous integration and continuous development and continuous testing and all the other things that are DevOpsy now. When we place the thing in operations, then the abstraction also continues, right? Then we're still monitoring the containers through this abstraction layer?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. So we go around and we say we're less opinionated about how the infrastructure itself works. So if you want a different service discovery mechanism than what we provide, we want to be able to allow you to plug that in and use it. If you want a different way of introspecting containers, we want to allow you to do that, or a different way of storing data on different types of devices. We want to abstract that away and be able to, our system itself is very modular. It's all containers as it is. And we want to allow people to take out certain solutions and plug in other solutions and be able to do that in a fairly straightforward way without causing a lot of pain.
So Luke, do you agree?
Yeah, sounds good.
Oh, thanks. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to kind of go down the line and really talk about where the ecosystem is going in the next year, not the next 2 years or 5 years, because this thing is moving quick. So as we're at this conference in a year's time, what are we talking about? What's going to be important that are really going to be on our radar screen that's not on our radar screen now around ecosystem stuff? And Gabriel, I'll start with you.
Sure. So, I think with regard to the ecosystem development, I think one of the focuses really needs to be on, as an industry, agreeing on the right primitives, because this stuff needs to be built from the bottom up. And when you talk about things like governance, if we're not working off, for example, declarative, ways of managing infrastructure, it becomes really difficult to model policy, right? And it also becomes really difficult for different vendors, to provide solutions around, for example, governance if the primitives aren't agreed upon, because you got to do the one for this, end solutions for every different approach out there. I'd really like to hope that, I really hope that, in a year's time, some of these primitives will have been sorted out. A better understanding of, through OCI and through CNCF, where things are headed with regard to, container runtimes and image formats and, cluster managers, and we can move the focus of everyone onto the next set of problems. I think, Luke's list and adding governance and some other things are going to be really important, and, I'm just hoping that we can take an approach on agreeing on the right primitives. Because if we don't, then this is all a house of cards.
Can you give me an example in the history where we've agreed upon primitives? Because I've yet to kind of cite one. Because everybody shows up with their own agenda, right? Their own selfish mix of things, and that has a tendency to kind of throw things off the rail.
Yeah, and I'm not a believer in standards bodies always coming out with the best possible outcome. But I do actually think that weighing solutions on technical merits will, at the end of the day, result in the right solution getting adopted. Call me an optimist.
You are such an optimist. Boris, what do you think?
Well, I see. I agree with you, but I see things from a slightly different angle. It's like, yes, to me, the way you reach agreement is somebody wins, right? So I think that 1 year from now, if we're still sitting here and having the same discussion, probably we will have seen an evolution, and either organically or inorganically, the community will have started gathering around some of these options, right? So it's good and healthy that there are several options now for essentially every level of the container stack, right? From the runtime to the orchestration to everything else. It's like people will probably just pick something, and some of you mentioned some of these technologies seem to be, becoming winners, and I think it will be much more clear 1 year from now. The other thing is I'm ready to bet that this panel 1 year from now will need many more chairs because it's clear, it's clear, number one, that containers are here to stay. And number two, that yes, there are still many unsolved problems with containers. And again, it happened 15 years ago with virtual machines. VMware became the de facto standard by winning, right? It's not as clean, but let's say they are the standard for virtualization. But at the same time, there's a strong ecosystem was created that is still alive now with many vendors and many winners, And I think the same is going to happen with containers, especially because you cannot retrofit very easily what we have now to make the enterprise comfortable and cozy with using containers. So there's work to be done, and there's very bright minds at work here, and I see these only expanding.
Great.
So two things. So first is the managed software as a service model, the on-prem SaaS deployment model, and moreover, I think the containers are a little bit like the Industrial Revolution was to cars. Cars were invented, nobody drove them, and then the Industrial Revolution hit, and then everybody had cars. And I think container technologies and technologies like container technologies will give us this advent of clouds appearing, to where there are millions of clouds around the world running on, and where you have SaaS software in a particular cloud, multiple SaaS offerings talking to each other inside those clouds, and the tens of thousands of those. And I think we'll see the emergence of that in the next year. And and then the second thing is the continued, which is somewhat related because of the trust mechanisms, the continuance of emergence of immutability in the infrastructure operationally. And I think we've seen that starting to emerge out of the box and out of the OS and out of the containers, and I think we'll see it continue to go up the stack.
Good.
Yeah.
Luke, bring us home.
So I think that's a really good point, Cord. I think that the promise of containers has always been portability, and the idea that you can deploy your application in one place, in one area of the different space of possible runtime environments, and that you can also deploy your containers in the other axis of different stages in the software development lifecycle and move them around easily between those areas. I think that we're going to see more and more of that. I was initially skeptical, but I'm already seeing customers asking for multi-cloud and hybrid cloud deployments, and I think that containers are a key that unlocks that, but I think I think there's much more work to be done to actually truly enable it. And I also think, to the point of standards and pluggability, it's important for an ecosystem to have open standards and have pluggability. And I think if you take the example of Docker plugins, which I was very involved with, we did work closely with Docker and succeeded in getting a plugin system in there. I think that standards should be led by successful implementations and rough consensus and working code. And I think on that basis, and on the basis of technical merit, we can create a better ecosystem for everyone and reduce duplication of effort.
You're here.
All right, guys, that's all the time we have for. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank our audience. You guys did a great job in answering some very difficult questions. Now it's time to go drink.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.